My first opportunity with Christian leadership occurred when I was 15. It was in the midst of a 3-week leadership and trainings / wilderness adventure trip, which itself was a part of the leadership pipeline for a Christian camp. The first year was the aforementioned wilderness adventure. The second year was focused on servant leadership, 5 weeks as kitchen and custodial staff, along with a week of shadowing. From there, you became a junior counselor until you were 18, when you could become an official chief, as we were called. I'd never been to the camp before. I certainly wasn't interested in their pipeline. I signed up for the adventure. 3 weeks spent canoeing, hiking, and rock climbing. Each of us teenagers took our turn as leader of the day, which meant setting the pace on the hike, overseeing breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and delivering at the close of the day a devotional, which terrified me. What stands out to me on reflection is the intentionality in shaping us as young spiritual leaders. So much of which was made possible by the flexibility of youth. I walked away from the church for a season in my late teens and early 20s, but upon my return, I was involved in campus ministry and experienced something rather similar in intentionality in raising up and cultivating young spiritual leaders. If you become a Christian later in life, the opportunity for that kind of focused development, it's really hard to come by. I mean, who's got time for it with jobs, families, and all of the other things that life throws at us? I have to be honest, though, as much as I love systems and pipelines, trainings, not to mention books, when I read Acts, that stuff seems pretty non-existent. Look at chapter 14, verse 23. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. This is a follow-up verse to where we all left off last week. Paul and Barnabas were retracing their steps, visiting each church they planted on their way through, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. How much time do you think Paul and Barnabas spent in each of these locations along their travels? We're not given much to go on, but it doesn't seem like they were putting down deep roots, does it? In Pisidian Antioch, they show up. Paul preaches on the first Sabbath. The second Sabbath, the place is packed. It couldn't have been much longer before they're heading to Iconium. My point is this: these elders, the church leaders, hadn't been Christians all that long. Years later, Paul wrote to Timothy in Ephesus. And discussing the qualifications of a leader, he says he must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. Today, that makes total sense to us. But in Paul's day, how do you define recent? Paul planted the church in Ephesus around 52 AD. Then he wrote Timothy what was likely one of his last letters 10 years later. 10 years! That's probably the largest span. In many cases and places, not being a recent convert was probably months or years, but in that case, still counted on just a few fingers. So if many of them were by our standards, newer Christians, with little training, what did they rely on? Why was it so successful? Well, look at their process. With prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord, those in whom they had put their trust. Prayer and fasting. In other words, they put their trust in the Holy Spirit, not in their expertise, to guide and to lead. And that doesn't mean that it's a waste of time for us to try and grow and sharpen ourselves as leaders. It just means that the connection to the Holy Spirit is the most important part of our ministry. At whatever level we happen to serve. Whether you're on the board of deacons or whether you're working with babies in children's ministry. A second point that we ought to recognize, a lot of us aren't so far from leadership as we might think. God is not looking for fully finished leaders. He's looking for faithful followers who will surrender to the Spirit's leading and say to others, come with me. And come with me. Doing what we're called to do. Leaving the rest up to Him. Have a great week.